I'm working on a pattern called the Easy VT for little girls. Here it is, and it will appear shortly in Country Knitting and Main News and Views. This can usually be knitted on either a mid-gauge or bulky machine. Bonds are typically thought of as bulkies. They have 8mm spacing between the needles, same for Knitsmart. And a lot of basic bulky and mid-gauge patterns will work on bonds and Knitsmarts, but the question always is what key plate to use and how do I swatch? So the purpose of this video is to help you figure that out. Begin by using your hem or a cast-on comb and casting on a good wide piece of knitting. Using at least 4 inches of knitted width is much more accurate of a gauge predictor than using just a few stitches. Here I cast on in the main yarn and used key plate 2 to knit a few rows. Now we need a place to start from, so I'm marking off with green yarn just by hand knitting in a few stitches so we can measure the vertical dimensions starting here. I have actually used 24 stitches, but I'm marking off the second stitch in from each edge. That leaves a span of 20 stitches between the marks, and that's what we'll measure. The very edge stitches in any piece of knitting don't make very good predictors of gauge. So we've got spots to measure from left to right and spots to measure from top to bottom, and we'll keep on knitting a swatch. I'm using DK yarn here. That would be number 3, using that kind of measure. This is my best guess for what's going to work well, key plate 20. So I'm going to knit quite a few rows, what I believe will be more than 4 inches, using key plate 20. Bond knitters, this is probably most similar to your key plate number 2. Every so often, stop and check that everything's all right. In this case, I realized my end stitches were getting loose and that I needed to add claw weights. The comb was no longer quite enough. And every so often, repeat the marking of the second stitch from the edge or whatever one allows you to have a predicted number of stitches in the middle of the work to measure. I wanted to measure 20 stitches, so out of 24, I marked the second from each edge. Those things are variable, but you do want a good wide piece of knitting. So here come a couple more yarn markers to be hung in the same manner as the ones before. I'll do this every so often and then continue knitting until we have at least 4 inches worth of knitting. At that point, mark across the row again. If this is the only key plate that you're planning to test, just knit a few more rows and drop the swatch off of the machine. But I would also like to try key plate 15. Bond knitters, this would be closest to 1 dot, I believe. Trying multiple key plates will allow you to tweak the gauge and also will keep you from getting a fabric that's surprisingly stiffer or floppier than you had in mind. I'm pretty happy with the number 20 fabric, but I would just like to compare. So we go through the same process, every so often marking the second stitch from the edge, and after at least 4 inches of knitting, marking across the entire row so that we've got parameters to measure to, left and right, top and bottom. Knit a few rows past the last mark and then give a gentle lengthwise tug to set the stitches. The most accurate measurement will be achieved if you allow the fabric to relax for at least 2 hours after knitting it, and or you wash and allow it to dry before doing the measuring. There are several ways to measure. One is what you see me doing. I'm counting rows up to 20 and measuring what point that is on the ruler. We'll do the same thing for stitches as we do for rows. Now get out your trusty calculator. Here, 20 stitches took up 2.75 inches. The result of the division is 7.272727 and on. We would round to 7.27 rows per inch, or if you want to make it simpler, it's even okay to call it 7.3. And that is what is meant by the row gauge for this fabric. Here's another way to count. There's a little window in one of the rulers that came with the Knitsmart. We can count the stitches that show through the window. I counted and came up with 28. The window method tends to be more accurate than laying the ruler alongside a column of stitches. That's because the window makes it easier to be certain of your alignment. And doing it this way, I came up with a very similar but not identical gauge of 7 rows per inch. What I like to do if I come up with a discrepancy like that, although it's not a large discrepancy, is let the fabric and my eyes rest for a little bit while longer and come back and measure again. And if there's still a discrepancy, I'd go with the window method. If you do not own a ruler with a nifty little window, you can make something similar by cutting a 4-inch square out of a 6-inch piece of cardboard and use it to lay on the fabric and count within that window. There's a third method of arriving at the gauge, and we'll practice that with the stitch gauge. I've got the ruler laid across, measuring between the 2 yarn markers, so we know we are measuring 20 stitches. To do this, it's important that the fabric is relaxed and held flat, so I've got cast-on combs above and below and the ruler laid on it, attempting to do all this without distorting the fabric. In this case, the 20 stitches measure 3 5/8 inches. And we need to turn our 5/8 into a decimal in order to continue. That's really easy. Put into your calculator 5 divided by 8, and the result 0.625 means that 3 5/8 is the same as 3.625, and that's a number we can work with. The 20 stitches divided by the 3.625 inches is 5.517, and so on. It would be safe to round this to 5.5 stitches per inch and use that as our stitch gauge. All of these methods of measuring and doing the figuring are using the identical mathematical principle. They are not different. It's just that there are multiple ways to achieve the same mathematical result, and you should choose the one that you feel most comfortable with and can most reliably perform. So now, looking at the fabric, if I were undecided and liked them equally well, I would go through the same measurement process on the top half of the swatch made with the smaller key plate and see which one was closest to the pattern. But I very much prefer the first piece of the swatch. The top one is a little bit too stiff for a child's blouse, in my opinion. So I'm going to choose the first gauge and compare it to the pattern and see how that will work. It happens fairly often to machine knitters that they don't get the exact gauge they hoped for. It happens more when using the Bond and the Knitsmart machines because they have fewer stitch size options. So we need to learn 2 things: how to predict what size you will actually get when knitting a pattern, and how to adjust that pattern to get the size you actually want. And I am covering that in the next video.